Okay, so today we're going to be looking at Google Sheets and how you can use it to do practically anything in your business. It's a fantastic database platform that you can use to store data, to retrieve data, to do complex calculations, and it fits really well with Make.com. So let's jump in and see what we can do. First up, let's have a look at the different triggers and actions that we can use in Make.com. Now, when you're using Google Sheets, you can use any of these actions as a trigger. If you are going to use an action such as adding a row or updating a row, then you'll need to set a schedule so that action runs at a particular interval because there's no trigger for that action. If we're using a trigger that has an instant or an ACID next to it, then that trigger runs based on the data that's already in Google Sheets. So if it is a ACID trigger, then what that means is it's going to look at Google Sheets at our scheduled time, and it's then going to look for new changes to rows in that Google Sheet document. In this case, it's looking for new rows being created in our Google Sheet. So let's try this out. Here I'm going to map in my sheet ID. So to get the sheet ID, I just need to get the URL of the sheet that I'm working with. And in the URL, you'll see spreadsheets/D, and then we've got our sheet ID here. So let's go ahead and copy out the spreadsheet ID, and then we'll put that in our scenario. Next, we need to map in our sheet name. And this is case sensitive. So I like to just copy the sheet name from Google Sheet and then paste it into here. Now you also have the option of selecting a Google Sheet by a path. And if you do this, then you'll already have the drop-down list of the sheet name. And in this case, I have my sheet in the main level of my folder here, and it's just called Untitled Spreadsheet. And then you can see here that it already loads in the sheet names, and then we can select from those here. Now, if we go ahead and add a new sheet, you'll see that it doesn't immediately show up in this sheet name list. To get it to show up in the list, we've got two options. We can click our refresh sheet name list here, and then our new sheet will show up. Or we can just close out of the settings and then open those same settings up again. And when we reopen it, the new sheet will load here. So you can see when we click that, it automatically does a refresh of the data. So here we've got our spreadsheet connected and we've selected our sheet that we want to look at. Next, we have whether the sheet contains headers or not. And it's very important to make sure you check the right option here, because if we check that our sheet does not contain headers, then it's going to return this as the first record in our sheet. Our header row will be the first record. And that obviously is not going to be ideal because it's not actually data that we care about. So for most of the time, you want to keep that set to yes, because you will have a header row. If you've got multiple rows with headers in your Google Sheet, then you can set this here to be multiple rows. For instance, if we had a row above, so we've actually got two header rows, then what we'd need to do is set our row with headers to be A1 to Z2. And what that means is it will be from A1 all the way down to Z2. Right. So that covers both of those rows and all the content within them. In this example, we're just going to look at one row, so it should just be A1 to Z1. Then we've got the option here of setting a limit. And because we're watching for new rows, this limit is going to limit how many new rows are returned each time this trigger runs. So if we set that to 2, it will only return 2 new rows when we run this trigger. So let's run now. And you can see it returns 2 new rows, even though there are actually 20 rows for it to select from. If we run it again, we'll get 2 new rows, Bob and Alice, and you can see here that those rows are 3 and 4, and the first 2 were John and Jane. So it's just going down the list here and pulling 2 each time that it runs. If we set that to 4, then it will pull in 4 rows instead of 2. And it will just always keep its place in the system. So here we've got Gary, and of course he comes after Alice. So we've got Gary, Tina, Mark, and Laura. Now, each time it runs, because it's an ACID trigger, it's going to essentially mark where it is in the list. So it runs in the last row that it collects is Laura, and therefore it just goes, right, I remember that I saw everything before Laura, therefore next time I run, I just need to care about these rows here because they're the ones that I haven't looked at yet. Now let's compare that to a search rows trigger. A search rows trigger will always return all the rows that it finds in the search. So here we're searching the same customer table, and we've got the same settings here of it contains headers and it has the column range or header range. And then again, we've got the option of setting a maximum number of rows. So let's set 2 rows to be returned here, and then we'll run our logic. And you'll notice that this time we get John and Jane, row 1 and 2, John and Jane. And if I run this again, it's going to get the same rows every single time I run it, because my filter is simply, does the email exist? And yes, the email exists. And it always searches from the top of the list down to the bottom of the list. And I've said, just return the first 2 records in this list that match this filter. If I set this to return 5 records, then it will always return the first 5 records that it finds. And you can see it returns John, Jane, Bob, Alice, and Gary, which are the first 5 records in our base here. If I was to remove Bob's email address, then it will not return Bob because he does not match our filter. And it will then return the next one that it finds, which is Tina. So we can see it returns the first 2 because they have an email. Then it skips Bob because he doesn't have an email. And then it returns the next 3 because we've got a maximum of 5 records to be returned. And it skips Bob because he doesn't match our filter. So now let's combine these 2 modules. We've got 2 search rows modules. The first module, we're going to be looking at the customer list. The second module, we're going to be looking at the order list. And what we're trying to do here is look up the customers. And then for each customer, I want to then look up to see what order they've made in the system. Now to do that, I need to filter the orders by the customer ID. And I've got the customer ID here in my customer table. And I'm just going to set a filter where the customer ID of the order is equal to the customer ID of the customer. So we can see the first step in our scenario runs and it has 1 operation used. We searched Google Sheet using 1 operation, and that search returned 5 bundles of data. Now, how that returns in the output is we have 1 collection of data per row. And each collection then looks up the order, and that row is a separate thing in the scenario now because we've got a separate bundle of data per row. So the next step in our scenario, it will then process each one of those rows individually in this search for orders step. So if we look here, we can see we've used 5 operations, 1 for each row. The first operation was filtering for the first customer in our Google Sheet, which is John. And John has a customer ID of number 1. And so now it's looking for the order for John. And this is a simple database, but it's got the customer ID here of 1. So we should get the laptop returned in our search result. And that's what we get here. Then the second bundle has a customer ID of number 2. And we get returned in our result the stethoscope, which is what customer number 2 ordered. And you can see that here from the ID of the customer. Now, what happens if we actually have multiple orders for the same customer? Okay, so I've added 2 new orders here for customer number 1. Now, to get that data into this scenario, we would have to rerun the scenario because it's new data that I've just added. And we can see here the same logic runs. We've checked 5 rows because that's what we returned in the first step. But now for our first row, customer number 1, we then return 3 bundles of data. 3 rows were found on the order table. And these 3 rows are the first one, order number 1001, and order number 1021 and 1022. All 3 of those were ordered by customer number 1. Now, if we were to process after this step, we would actually have 3 bundles of data for customer number 1, plus then 1 bundle of data for each of the other customers because they only had 1 order in the system. So even though it says that we've got 5 operations here, on the next step, we would actually have 8 operations or 8 bundles of data being used. So let's assume that we want to send a confirmation email after the order is placed. Well, we just add our email module. Here we've got the option of mapping in the email address, which we would normally map to the customer. We've got the list of order details, then we've got the list of customer details. So we would map the customer's email in here, but because I'm testing this, I'm just going to use a dummy email. Then we could then write the email body, and here we've got the option of HTML or plain text. For simplicity, I'm just going to use plain text here and put in some basic mapping. And the data for the order ID and the product, well, that sits on the order table. Here, I also want to map the customer information. Now, on the order table, all I have for the customer is the customer ID, but that doesn't really make sense. Now, I want to address the customer in the email. Well, I can go back to the previous module and I can reference that customer's information. So I can put the customer name and last name there. Now, you can see here that when this ran, we got our customers, 5 customers, and then here we actually got 8 bundles of data here. We got 8 orders. So when this particular email ran, and the first 3 bundles had separate orders. So they all got sent to the same customer, John Doe. We've got his laptop bag, and then his microphone. And that's not ideal because now we've spammed this customer with way too many emails, particularly if they order 10 or 20 items. Whereas the other customers just ordered 1 item and they just got 1 email. How we would resolve this is we want to show all the orders in 1 email. And to do that, we'd want to aggregate the data. And here I'll just use a simple text aggregation. And because we're aggregating data, we need to know where we're going to aggregate that data from. Now, the list that I'm aggregating is going to be from the order module. That's where I've got my list of orders that I want to combine into 1 text. So here I've got my source module of order. And for each one of those orders, I'll map in order ID here and the product name. Then when I come across to my email, I want to replace this part of my email with my text that I'm aggregating. Now, if there's only 1 order, then it's just going to aggregate 1 time. But if there are 3 orders, well, then it's going to aggregate 3 times. So let's run this now. We get the same customers. We get 1 customer, the first one. And now we see that for the first customer, we still got those 3 orders returned. But this time we aggregated those 3 bundles of data into 1 new bundle of data, which then contains all 3 of those orders. So when the email gets sent, we are now sending 1 email that contains 3 orders, rather than 3 emails that contain 1 order each for this customer. Okay, so what happens if we have a customer without an order? Well, I've just changed the data here, and I've changed customer number 2 so that they do not have an order in the system. Now, when it runs, we get customer number 2 as our second bundle. So it's a second operation here. And you can see there were no orders found for customer number 2. Now, to make sure that we don't send an email, I have to filter this in 2 places. I have to first filter the orders that I'm aggregating to make sure that I'm only filtering and adding orders to my aggregation where the order actually exists. If I don't do that, well, then I'll still get an aggregation, but it will just have the text and the empty line in it. Next, I want to filter out to make sure that the email only gets sent if I have an aggregation to send. Now, if I don't have this first filter in here, the aggregation will still exist, and so the email will still send. And the aggregation still exists because it has this hard-coded text here. So now that I've got this filter in, you can see that the first customer had 3 orders. The second customer didn't have any orders, so they didn't pass this first filter. And because they didn't pass the first filter, they didn't pass the second filter because the aggregation had no data. So now let's have a look at how we would work with a form submit. Now, I've just got a basic trigger here to simulate the form submission. And in the form, we've got our first item. And within that 1 item, we have 3 fields of data. We've got the first name, last name, and email. And when that form is submitted, we want to just add a row to our sheet. We will map that form submission to the customer table. We're going to just map in these fields here, and we will run this 1 time to make sure that our mapping is correct. And we can see our new data returns here. Now, I'm not too worried about these fields being missing because they weren't in the form entry, but I am worried about this customer ID missing. So how are we going to get the customer ID and put 21 in here? Because that's the next number in the sequence. Well, that's fairly easy, and we'll just combine the search module to find the maximum number and then add 1 to that number. So here I've added my search step, and this is actually a fairly lightweight search. So how I set this up is I map it to my sheet of customer, then I'm filtering where the customer ID exists, because I always need to have a filter for my search module to run. Then I'm setting my sort order as descending. So that means that it's going to start at the highest number and then descend towards the lowest number. I'm ordering it by the customer ID field, and then I'm setting the field type as number so that it orders it correctly. So what this should do is it should return one record, and that one record should be number 20 because it's the highest number. So I'll add my result into here, and the result will be customer ID. Then I go to math, and I'm just going to add and then a number 1. So let's run this now, and we'll get another row created, and you can see we do indeed get 21. If I run this again, the highest number should then be 21, and so then it counts up to 22. But this is still not ideal, and that's because now we have duplicates in our system. We haven't allowed for any deduplication of the data. So let's have another think about this. And we actually need another search row to see if we have that customer already existing in our database. So here we're going to instead filter by the email. And we want to use something like case insensitive because people like to write their emails in different ways. Sometimes they put capitals, sometimes they don't. So we always want to use a fairly fuzzy search here. And what this step is going to do is it's going to look for a record that matches the email. So let's run this here once. And we do indeed get one match on that record. When we do find a match, we don't want to create a new record. So we'll add a router in here, and we're going to set this route to only run if the record, the row ID, does not exist. If there is an existing row existing, well, then we just want to update that row with the new data that we've collected in the form. Here I've added an update row, and I need to map in my row number. Then I can update my fields, and I only want to do this if the row ID does exist because I'm updating the row. If I tried to do that where the row ID did not exist, then it would throw an error on this module. But having the filter here means that I won't get an error. So I search for my record. It then doesn't take the first path because it doesn't pass the filter of the row ID being missing, but it does pass the filter of the row existing, and therefore it updates my row. Now, if I just simply get rid of these rows here, we'll submit the form for the contact, then looks up the records, does not find a row, creates the new record, counts the correct number here. If I was to resubmit that form for some reason, then it will not create a new row because instead it updates that existing row here. Now, this little tree of logic is actually quite useful. I use it in a lot of different databases, Pipedrive, Airtable, all of those different things. You will quite often need to do a search and then a search and create or an update based on the data that exists or does not exist. You could also simplify this here by not using a filter and just using a fallback so that if it doesn't pass this route, well, then it will fall back to creating the new row instead. Let's have a look at a slightly more advanced concept here, and that's the bulk updating or bulk creating. Now, how the bulk updater and creator work is that it allows you to do multiple updates to multiple rows at the same time. And this is incredibly powerful if you're trying to copy one database to another database or make bulk changes to large data sets because it saves you a lot of operations. You don't have to spend one operation per row. You can batch it and spend one operation per 100 rows or 1,000 rows. If you've got a lot of data that you're updating, then you may want to limit it to maybe do it in batches of 10 or 100, because the more data you put in, the higher the chance of an API timing out because you're trying to do too much with it in the one call. So generally a batch of 100 or so is about right. Now, how this works is we need to have a source of a list from somewhere. Here I'm just getting a list of rows from Google Sheets, and I'm setting my target structure here to the structure of rows from the module that I want to map into, and that's my bulk update module. So by doing that, the aggregator module knows the intended data structure that is going to be accepted by that particular module. And here it just needs to have one column because that's all that we're updating in our data structure. So I've mapped into that one column the lowercase of the name, and you can see it lowercases it here. If I change that to uppercase, I can then bulk update all of my data to be uppercase or capitalized. And the next time we run this, it will change all these lowercases to capitalize the first letter. Now, importantly, when we're setting the range, we want to make sure that we don't include the header row in the range. If we do include the header row, well, then it's going to update the header as well as if it's a row that we're searching for. And that would be fine if we don't have a header row, or if our search returned the header as well, then it would update correctly. But if we did it in this case, our initial search returns these 20 rows. And if we don't exclude the header, well, then it will update these 20 rows. And you'll notice here that it misaligns it by one row. So we set that to be 2. And then we have to set a maximum here on the range as well, which I've just set as 100 rows for this example. Then we're mapping in our array, and that's the output from this array aggregator module. And when we map that in, we're only updating one column. Now, here's a little bit of confusion because you may think that we need to map 2 columns to get to the second column. But because I've set my range here of B2 to B100, I'm only looking at and bulk updating this data here. And you'll notice that it starts from the second row, that's B2, and then it goes all the way down to B100. So that's the area that I'm bulk updating. I'm not doing the header, I'm not doing any other columns, I'm just doing B2 to 100. You can adjust that obviously to update multiple columns if you want, but here I'm just doing one, and that's what I've got in my mapping. If you are going to do multiple columns, then you would need to add multiple columns here, and then you can adjust the logic as needed. Now, if we run this, we'll see that these are all lowercase currently, and when I run it, they're all going to magically change to start case. And the total operations used there is 3. If I was going to do it without this bulk updater and just use a search and update step, well, you'd have 1 operation for the search, then you're going to have 21 operations, 1 for each row, to then update the data in each row. And you'll notice that when it does it, it just goes down the line and updates 1 row at a time. So that's the batch updater, and you can use that to create or update. Here's a very simple example, but you could do it for bulk updating orders from a CSV. You could poll orders from a system, and then you could bulk update that polled search result into a Google Sheet. There's a lot of different ways that you can use this bulk updater and create. Okay, so we can also play around with the sheets in the API. We can delete a sheet, add a sheet, list the sheets in the spreadsheet. And this is quite handy if you just want to bulk delete a whole bunch of data. It's just easier to delete the sheet and then create a new sheet each time. Well, you could do that here. And as an example, I've just got my list of sheets, customer, order, and new. And then I've just put a filter in here, so I only delete the new sheet. And then I'm deleting that new sheet, and then I'm just creating a new sheet called new number 1. So we can see when this runs, it passes through my filter, and I'm deleting the old new sheet here, and then I create the new sheet here. And that will just essentially change the name because there's no data in that sheet. But that's a nice, easy way if you wanted to just clear out a whole bunch of data and then put in a whole bunch of new data. Well, then you can just delete the sheet and create a new sheet.